Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm FREDRICKA Whitfield, anchor of CNN Newsroom Weekends. Welcome to this closing plenary, Reimagining the Future. Schools have started in much of the nation, and today, of course, we've had a full day of this valuable virtual summit, and still there are questions that remain. You know, how should schools fully reopen? Who should remote learn? Who should teach remote learning? Is this a school year that is lost? And can kids really learn and benefit as best they can from such a variety of issues? And is the gap between the haves and the have-nots, is that widening? What needs to change right now to promote and protect the greatest potential for every child in every neighborhood, in every apartment building, in every shelter? Because times are that tough. We've got a good number of our kids now who are operating and living in shelters. So we're going to try our best to tackle all of these questions. I've got an incredible panel with me now. You're seeing some of them, all of them now. You can see us all in this big box. PAULA KERGER, President and Chief Executive of PBS, the nation's largest non-commercial media organization. Dr. Spencer Crew, Acting Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Secretary ARNE DUNCAN, Managing Partner at Emerson Collective and former U.S. Secretary of Education. And Secretary Margaret Spellings, CEO of Texas 2036 and former U.S. Secretary of Education. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
So, you know, if anyone has children at home, you know that this is a particularly taxing and challenging time. I've got twin second graders and I've got a 15-year-old high school sophomore, and taxing and challenging at a very minimum is what we're all experiencing. But I wonder to you, Secretary Spellings, you know, should we all change our expectations of what getting an education is today in a pandemic?
Well, we shouldn't change our expectations that everyone is well served and that they're on a path progressing to their fullest potential and getting a year's worth of education that we taxpayers continue to pay for and that these children and students so desperately need. But we do need to change our expectations about how that's going to happen. Clearly, time is just a concept now. The school year, these arbitrary 185, 200-day schedules are out the window. We need to think about how we deploy and use human capital, our teachers. We need to think about how we use the physical plant. And so everything is on the table as we reinvent education, but we cannot shy away from expectations that this is not a lost year. This is a year that not only is not lost, but we need to double up and make great progress for our students.
And Paula, you know, on PBS Kids, you know, there is a commitment to really opening children's eyes, and it really is about thinking, you know, outside of the box. So, you know, should we all be looking more outside of the classroom, outside of these remote learning classrooms that are at home? What are the resources in which to do that?
Well, look, we have, since our beginning 50 years ago, actually, October 4th is our 50th anniversary, we've been very involved in education. Most of our stations have an E in their call letter because we started out as educational television. So in this 50th anniversary, I thought we'd be talking about Julia Child, and instead we're spending a lot of time really in a very deep dive around service to schools. We're all local, our stations. We're the last in many communities, last locally owned, operated, and governed. And many of our stations have very deep relationships in schools. In fact, some of our stations are owned by school systems. I got a call early March from Austin Butner from LA Unified. And he said, look, I think that we've got kids that are going to be at home. And we know that you offer this robust learning experience through broadband. We had 1 million users a month. We jumped within a month to 4 million users, all contextualized lesson plans and so forth. But what he was most concerned about were the kids in LA that were going to not have access to broadband. And what do we do? You know, you can't, we are all well aware of this digital gap. And even in the short term, how do we close that? How do we look for ways, not just in light education, but in true educational experiences? How do we help reach those kids? So we began very quickly to convert our broadcast air to lessons of the air, which is how we started, ironically, at the beginning. So, I think there are a lot of questions in this period that we're in right now of what we should be doing, everything from the work we do with the littlest kids, which is all core curriculum. But also, as we look to the future, it is clear that that hybrid learning, asynchronous learning is going to be a continuum. And how do we, public media stations, state agencies, other organizations like the Smithsonian, how do we all come together and look at this new learning paradigm and think about both how are we reaching kids that have access and means through, through broadband platforms and others, but how do we make sure that we're not leaving kids behind? Even as a nation, we're debating the policy of everything from, access to ubiquitous broadband and so forth. So I think that this is a moment, that obviously we need to be working very hard so that we're not losing time, but also we should be looking at the future to figure out how we're building something that will close gaps for the long term.
Mm-hmm. Access, that's key. Secretary Duncan, there has been no national plan during this pandemic as it pertains to education. So school districts have been doing, the best that they can and have been guided by, such a variation of leadership. So, how worried are you about the disparities, the differences in the approaches and the standards?
Well, we haven't had a national plan to defeat the virus, and we haven't had a national plan to try and educate. And unfortunately, this virus in education doesn't know red versus blue or state boundaries, and the absence of leadership at the federal level has been devastating. It's cost thousands of lives. It's had a really detrimental, destructive impact on children's education. For that total absence of leadership at the federal level, talking to local superintendents across the country, their creativity and humility and urgency and compassion in which they're working is extraordinary. We have 15,000 school districts in this country, though. The fact that they're trying to do all these things by themselves is really hard. Talked about LA. What Austin's doing there is he's trying to put in place an entire public health system. He's trying to test every child, every adult, their family. It's unbelievable what we're asking school systems to do. And I don't want to just talk about the educational part. They're feeding children, have done that throughout the pandemic. They're trying to take care of children's social and emotional health. So just heroic work at the local level, but it's way too hard. They shouldn't be in this position. It's not fair, and it's not right.
Yeah, it is really hard. Our hearts go out to the educators and, of course, to all the families and parents who feel like they are, trying their best to be surrogate teachers and instructors, and there's no, lesson plan book for that. And, I think so many households are struggling and they're really worried about, whether their kids are getting the most out of this experience, even though so many resources are being poured into it district to district across the country. And I wonder, Dr. Crew, your museum is, a learning and teaching institution. I grew up in public schools in Montgomery County, Maryland, and, part of the curriculum was going to the Smithsonian, going to the variety of Smithsonian museums and buildings there. But because you've got this day of, social distancing, kids may not be able to do that. Except, Dr. Crew, you will be opening the doors very soon, right? Yes. But yes. How have you changed your capacity to instruct and reach kids?
Well, I think the focus for us has been to really shift our attention away from inside the building activities, which we've done an awful lot of, especially for training teachers and for hosting school groups. What we've moved more towards is trying to have a digital presence so that a lot of the learning, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the information that we have in the museum, we can now get outside of the museum to a variety of people. We found that not only teachers, but parents and caregivers are coming to us looking for materials and things they can use to help inform their children, but also give them sort of a variety of different ideas and concepts to wrestle with. So we found we have to be much more creative in how we do that. And also what we found out is that what we can provide for parents and caregivers, along with teachers, is a chance for them to step back and allow us to interact with the children and allow them a chance to take a deep breath. We found that has been just as important as anything else in terms of how we can be helpful to all those who are now trying to figure out about learning and about education in a new kind of way. What we've talked about is the importance of helping people care for themselves as well as care for their children and care about education. So we're hoping to provide that kind of a support system so that we can sort of step forward and provide educational experiences for children and others, and the caregivers and educators can take a deep breath and then sort of regroup to go back into the conversation.
Wow, that deep breath is really important. I mean, Secretary Spellings, I mean, families are stressed, beyond, any kind of notation, anything they've ever experienced before. And, you've got families who are, dealing with loss of jobs, loss of, their roofs over their heads, their, rent or their, mortgage cannot be met. But, how can the educational system, help these families when they're trying their best to help provide the education with these remote classes, but there are so many other stressors.
Right. Well, one thing I do think we're seeing, and it's been a hard lesson for sure, is that parents are understanding obviously how valuable our schools are, how important they are in so many ways. But secondly, they're also having a lens that they might not otherwise have had into their children's progress and into their reading levels and how well they're doing and not, and the kind of supports they need and the kind of resources it will take. And so I do think the fact that parents are understanding, oh my gosh, my kid may or may not be on track is a good thing. But, what I'm seeing is, communities, districts above all, and we're seeing really some very disturbing numbers right off the bat as school heads back where kids are lost. We're seeing, far reduced enrollment in early childhood programs. We're seeing just reduced numbers all over this country where kids and families they're just checked out. And that is a very, very worrisome sign. And we got to find them. We've got to recover them. We've got to get them back on track. And those are those families and parents that I worry most about, that they've just given up.
Yeah, Secretary Duncan, how do you measure what upsides have come from this very new uncharted territory for so many families?
I think there's a lot of downsides. I don't know if there's too many upsides. And I hate to even call them silver linings because, again, we shouldn't be in this position. But, okay, given that reality, the real question is, what do we do? So we were talking before the show started. I'd love to see a national tutoring program, a national tutoring initiative to help those kids across the country catch up who fell behind with COVID in the spring, fell behind with summer slide during the summer, and as Margaret just said, may not have enrolled back in school. So they're months and months behind. We can't allow that to happen. So we have to sort of step up, find those kids, do home visits, go, teachers, social workers go out. We can't just let them disappear. They disappear to what? There's nothing out there good for them. So one, we have to do that. Two, what can we do differently with technology? One is we can make sure every child in the country has access to a device and to the Wi-Fi, to internet. Children should not be confined to learning in a physical school building, and let children find their passion, find their genius, whatever that might be, so they can learn anything they want, anytime, anywhere, 24/7. Third, Margaret's talked a lot about this. In this remote world environment, what if our best algebra teachers were teaching not 100 kids a day, but 1,000 kids a day, or 10,000 kids a day, or 100,000 kids a day, and just using our best teachers to reach more and more students, and then use other time for individual instruction, small group instruction, tutoring, whatever it might be. And then finally, the school calendar is obsolete. Why do we have summer break? And we just need to meet kids where they are. Some kids, 9 months of school might be enough. For many kids, that's nowhere near enough. And we just got to think much more creatively. And that concept of time, I think, is absolutely, it's been antiquated for a long time. It's been outdated. Now is the time for us to deal with that reality and try and do something better.
Mm-hmm. Paula, you agree? It really is we're all challenged, with what do we do? But is this the motivation of reinvention of how to best reach kids, how to maximize resources that are available?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I just want to add in is we're talking about parents. There are a lot of teachers in the classroom right now. There are a lot of teachers in the classroom who are trying to manage hybrid classes where you may have 10 kids in a class and 20 kids in distance learning without training on how to manage that kind of environment. I think the stresses on teachers is unbelievable. We manage, we create, because we work with so many teachers across the country, I've sat in on a number of discussions with teachers because we have groups of early childhood champions that meet on a regular basis. We have teachers that we create virtual faculty rooms. And if you listen to those conversations, that should really make you sit up straight and think about, we have got to get our priorities straight in education in this country. Everything that's been thrown at teachers to try to figure out how they're going to manage during this period. The schools are open. They may or may not have all the tools and support they need. Parents are stretched beyond belief, and we're expecting teachers to jump in ways that they have never tried to anticipate before. Many of our stations, because we have experience in distance learning, and I agree with ARNE and Margaret that this idea of finding our best teachers and figuring out how to connect them to a much wider group. I mean, the technology enables that, but we also have to pay attention to how we are managing the mental health of teachers that are actually in the classroom now, and how we look to the future of, again, what I think will end up being a very different way of education. I agree, the school calendar has got to shift. Maybe this is the moment for that. Parents, I think, just sort of each through the spring semester, because it was March, April by the time that they were really having to deal with the kids at home. Some school systems really used the summer as a jumping off point. Many school systems really spent the time trying to figure out what they were going to do in the fall and hoped that the virus was going to be on a different trajectory. So now here we are. So what do we do about it? This is a big policy question. This is a big question by community. And I think there has to be a moment where we look at how are we going to fill these gaps? How are we going to create the opportunities? So, our stations, are even using their studios to do the educational content that gets broadcast. Because again, you cannot expect that every home is going to have access. For most homes, it's going to be this. And so, and which may or may not be connected to broadband. So, we've done a lot of work in this space. You download stuff into a device. You don't have to have a live broadband connection at all times. I think the pieces are there, but what we desperately need is some leadership to try to knit some of this together so that you don't have 15,000 solutions across the country, but you have some really good examples of what's working that can be built upon.
Dr. Cruz, you're nodding a lot there. What have you been hearing from families, caregivers, people that you've been in touch with about the digital divide, about the stress or alleviating some of the stress that just about every household is feeling if they're homeschooling?
I think what we've been learning echoes what all the others have been talking about, and that is the fact that this is a new era, a new way of trying to function and operate, and everyone trying to figure out how they can best provide for their children in this process. What we've done a lot of is to really listen to teachers and to parents and to find out what it is we can do and how we can provide information in a way that they find useful. A couple of things that have hit us along the way is that, first of all, that what people are saying is they want things in smaller, bite-sized chunks. They don't want long sort of instructional information that takes a long time to navigate, but instead wants sort of small chunks that they can use and get their children engaged and then step away from and go on to the next thing. So we've really looked at how we are providing data and information for those children. And I think as an institution, what we're trying to think about is that we are 19 different museums, and all of us have areas of expertise. And as an institution, what we're trying to look at is how do we begin to get our education departments to work in unison and work in collaboration so that we provide sort of a unified, organized set of materials that people can turn to and use. And how do we position those materials so that people find them useful? It's no point for us to create these things and throw them out and no one wants to use them. So listening to the teachers, listening to the parents, understanding how we can best provide this data for them has become an important part of what we do.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, in this pandemic, we are also dealing with, the nation with a reckoning, of race, and I'm wondering, Secretary Duncan, are you any more hopeful today that children of color, will have more equitable opportunities?
That's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
And Dr. King has the amazing quote, the arc of justice is long, but the arc of time is history's long, and it bends towards justice. I say it only bends if we put in the work. And this is a moment of reckoning for our country. And, again, very candidly, we've gone, in my belief, very much in the wrong direction in terms of equity, in terms of fighting racism the past couple of years. And so I would love, we're fighting two public health crises, a pandemic and systemic racism. That here in Chicago, we're fighting a third of gun violence. And, the intersection of all these are obviously the most disadvantaged communities, are Black and brown communities. And the question is, are we willing to reimagine, reinvent, and do something that's much more fair and equitable and just across our society, including in education? I don't think it's, finding a cure for cancer, putting a man on the Mars. This is a matter of courage and will. And I hope and pray we as a country can summon the courage so that we come out of here. The goal is not to go back to normal. The goal is to create something much better, because normal didn't work for millions of kids across the country. But sitting here today, I can't guarantee you that we will do that. I just hope to be a small part of the army that works to move us to a better place.
Dr. Cruz, do you have any reason to be more hopeful today?
You're on mute, Dr. Cruz.
I have lost his audio.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Okay.
I think we are at a time in the history of the country that has the possibility for, I think, going in a better, different direction. And the real question is, do we take advantage of it, and do we make the kind of commitment that's necessary? It's a commitment of will, but it's also a commitment of resources and a belief that we have to begin to equalize the resources that are available to all children so that they have that chance to access that. And the other thing that has been important for us to think about is also, how do we think about what these children face when they go to try to learn? That one of the challenges, I believe, is that now that they are more at home and having to work from home, all of those things in the environment that are pushing against them to take their attention away from learning become magnified. Yeah. And what we really have to begin to do is to take that into account in serious kinds of ways. We knew that when they were going into the school, that you had to make sure they were fed. You had to know what was going on at home, and something happened that had gotten them refocused on something else, and how do we bring them back in? I believe this is even more magnified as we have children at home and all those issues are right in front of them rather than something they can put aside for the course of the school day. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think a lot of issues to take into account. I don't think they're unsolvable, but I think they will take a lot of commitment and will to make them change and make them better.
Yeah, for so many kids, going to school might be, in small part an escape, but at the same time, home, what's going on at home is a huge distraction. And so getting an education then also becomes very complicated. I'm wondering, Secretary Spellings, if you have anything to add to that before I do kind of make a little shift in our topic.
Yeah, I just think we need a sense of urgency around that. We're hearing about Operation Warp Speed and debating whether we're going to have a vaccine within weeks or months. And it's an international imperative that everybody get a vaccine and so forth. We need that same sort of urgency and Operation Warp Speed mentality about the needs of our young people. It's less visible, but if we don't act now, the consequences of these gaps, this learning loss, it will be a crisis for our country and for, of course, these individuals, and it'll live on and linger for decades to come. So we need that urgency, resources, all the things that Dr. Cruz and ARNE spoke about, but an imperative that this is an urgent crisis situation.
It is. And Paula, you touched on this a bit earlier, talking about the obligation that, PBS has and what you have done to reallocate some of your resources to really meet the needs of families at home. And I'm wondering if, and this is just a free for all for anybody, if you want to talk further about, what obligation media outlets, private enterprise, civic organization spaces have, to jump into what, you just said, Secretary Spellings, is an urgent crisis.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely, for us, I mean, this is a public service moment. I mean, that's what the P and the S and PBS stands for. And I think that as we have looked at everything around education alongside of that, after the horrific murder of George Floyd, really beginning to look at, and building on our partnerships with organizations like the Smithsonian and others, on the wealth of content that has already been built to be shared out, both in broadcast, accessible to everyone. People forget broadcast television available to everyone, but also building new resources on particularly for families and for teachers who are seeking content, to talk to kids about this period we're in. How do you talk to kids and families about race and racism in a way that kids can process and understand? And, there are so many extraordinary scholars and people that have done great work in organizations like Dr. Cruz. And how do you bring that to even much larger audience? That's what we view our role as a megaphone. And I think during these periods of this period of time, not so dissimilar from the 50 years ago when public broadcasting was created, that I think there is a specific role for media. We have an outsized influence in society. I think there is an obligation. That's why my organization was created, is to try to use the tools that have access to reach everyone in a way that provides content that is of importance and significance at the time. And so I do think that this is a moment in our country's history, and to be able to think about a vast array of challenges, and you've touched on just a few as you think about kids not in school, not having access to free lunch. I mean, there's just an array of challenges that sit in front of us, but we have a moment where we could try to propel ourselves forward and look at what cracks already existed, but are just magnified by this by these twin epidemics that are facing us now.
So I'm hearing from everybody that everyone has to be part of solving the problems that we're experiencing in education across the board, whether it's school districts, whether it's the states, whether it's private enterprise, civic spaces, et cetera. But then who's going to make that determination, I wonder, of what really matters the most?
Well, it's going to be a major topic of state budget debates because obviously it all gets down to resourcing. In my perfect world, we'd have, kind of a clarion call and some national leadership around these imperatives, obviously some resources, but, obviously education is largely a state and local function. And so we got to get real about this moment of need matched up with resources, many of them restricted and constrained because of the economic situation, and then set ourselves some priorities. And Arnie and I were on a discussion earlier today. In my mind, early childhood, early years development, family support around that is certainly sacrosanct in my mind. And we're going to have to make some tough decisions about resources. What are the nice to haves and what are the must haves? And we have to resource, frankly, our neediest kids and communities in more vigorous ways than others. And that's been a hard thing for educators and policymakers around the country to do.
Dr. Cruz?
I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right. It's a matter of how do you balance out the resources available to all children who need to learn. And right now, it's not equally dispensed. And what we find out is that those who have less resources don't have an ability to get things equalized so that they're getting the same sort of attention, the same sort of material that other schools are getting, where either the taxes help pay for it or where the parents are able to chip in. And we really have to figure out how do we create a much more balanced resource distribution so that all children are at least getting the same basic minimum amount of resources as we go forward, as a way of beginning to equalize the whole process of learning.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Duncan?
I think, again, this is just a true moment of reckoning. And I frequently say that, a strong military is our best defense, that a great educational system is our best offense as a country. And when you look at state and local budgets, they're going to be crushed, sales taxes down, property taxes down. They're going to have to make some tough decisions, as Margaret has said, but they can't be doing this by themselves. And I just think now more than ever, we need a massive federal investment. And, absent that, just bad things are going to happen for education and bad things are going to happen for kids. And again, just always trying to be very real with the current administration, basically trying to bully people to go back to school, but no resources behind making those schools safe. It's just, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it's way too, should have happened months and months ago. We're into September now, but let's do something that would, make our schools safe, that would, more PPE, more custodians. Again, the national tutoring program I've been talking about, let's invest in our children, in our education at the federal level. That's the only place that the kind of resources that needs to come to local communities, that's the only place it can come from. It can't come at the local level. It can't come at the state level. That's dried up. And so that's what's missing now, just a total absence of investment, of commitment, of vision at the federal level.
I wonder if this conversion of the pandemic and education really revealed the deficits, exposed the needs, the real disparities. I wonder, what did this pandemic, what did it teach us? And that was particularly in families that I just spelled out, but what did it teach us about the deficits, the needs in the classrooms, in the school districts? Anybody have any strong thoughts about that?
Well, I'll start with an easy one, and that's broadband. I mean, we have nearly 6 million students in Texas, and nearly 1.8 million Texas students did not have access to either broadband or the devices to e-learn. And so when you have that kind of gap on something that's as basic as electricity or water, circa 2020, it's just horrifying. And so, I think that's a place where we can find consensus across party lines, and certainly facilitates telemedicine and e-commerce and on and on. And it's a great place to start. But just to give you the scale, about a third of our kids didn't have access to what it took.
Yeah, I think a lot of people saw that for the first time, even in, a number of news stories on various networks. One that really comes to mind, a really strong image of a mom. She had a minivan. She had 3 kids. I mean, they were all in elementary, middle school, and high school. And she would drive around looking for the fast food restaurant parking lot where they could get a signal so her kids could do their homework, online. I mean, yeah, and there you go, on the phone for a lot of people too. I wondered, Dr. Cruz, what have you been hearing or experiencing about, where the real deficits, the needs are in the educational system, the holes that have to be fixed?
What struck me as we've been talking is it's also a realization, I think, by a lot of people about how many different kind of roles schools play in the lives of children. There is a deficit in terms of resources for education directly, but the fact that kids go to school to get food. Kids go to school sometimes to get a stable adult relationship for themselves. Also, I think for parents is realizing how their children are doing, and maybe the things they thought were easy for teachers to do are much more challenging. And I think a greater appreciation for what schools provide in a broad spectrum of ways. In terms of education, I think I will go back to the idea of the need for resources and for commitment by all parts of the society to understand that the children are an important resource for us. And as Secretary Duncan has said, we invest now or we pay later. We might as well go ahead and invest now and really give these children a real start to life, as opposed to having to struggle later on with the deficits that have accrued over time.
Mm-hmm. Paula, do you see that these answers, might come sooner rather than later with greater urgency?
I mean, I would hope so. I mean, the fact that, this panel, this symposium, hopefully, opinion leaders and others will rally together. I mean, I think that, Margaret's comment about broadband is correct. I mean, if we could rally behind, as we did around, rural electrification a number of decades ago to ensure, and frankly, it is not just the wiring, it's making sure that from the economic standpoint that everyone has access to broadband. I mean, it's just, that is such a glaring divide. I think that the other is, is everything that gets heaped on the education system and on teachers in particular. And I think that this has been, Dr. Cruz said it well. I mean, there's so much that schools represent for kids, but also what we're expecting teachers to do now, is unrealistic. And I think that, a reckoning around that is important. And then Margaret's earlier comment about early childhood education. I mean, this is where we spend most of our time and in the work that we do, both in broadcast as well as in the wider space. We invest the least in the teachers that have the greatest impact on our kids. Everybody knows all of the research is done around brain science. It's in those early years when kids' brains are being wired and kids learn how to learn. And we treat early childhood teachers like babysitters. We pay them nothing. We give them no professional development. And, we reap the consequences. And so, I think that, there are a series of issues that, that we need to seriously address. And whether this is the moment that sort of jars people loose to pay attention to what's happening, or we see 10, 15, 20 years down the pike, the implications of this period that we're in, that's our choice. And as leaders, we can come together and try to resolve at least pieces of this, or we can step back and deal with the consequences later. That's our choice.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Duncan, do you believe this is a moment that will redefine the role of teachers, educators, and perhaps even redefine how people appreciate or what kind of resources are provided, district to district for educators?
In a really, really dark time, everyone's appreciation of teachers is way up. Teachers' polls are way, way up, and deservedly so. And so, again, it's not a new issue. Yeah. Sort of talking about the pandemic is revealing a lot of things, or ripping a Band-Aid off.
It's revealing, sure.
Stuff that we've known for a while, but how we train teachers, how we reward them, how we compensate them, how we help them develop, how we find our master mentor teachers and help them nurture and mentor the next generation. There's so much along that pipeline of talent that we must do better. No teacher goes into education to make $1 million. They're the most altruistic people you're going to meet. They shouldn't take a vow of poverty either. And investing in their training, investing in their professional development in this new world. How do you teach in this virtual world? We have to do that. We owe that to them. We owe it to our kids.
Yeah. Final thoughts for each of you as we wrap up this fantastic plenary session. I'll begin with you, Secretary Spellings. Any final thoughts, hopes, how you assess and wrap up everything that we've all experienced in just the first 8 months of this year?
Well, I think, people are seeing our schools for the vital institution that they are, for our families, for our workplace, for the progress of our kids, for the future of our nation. And we need to build on that recognition by seizing the day to, really maximize this opportunity. We need a Marshall Plan for our kids in this moment. And, I know everybody on this call will be, pounding the table in that way, but we're talking a lot about rescues for airlines and whatnot, and I'm all for them. But let's not forget about rescuing our most precious asset, our human talent of our country during this moment.
Paula,
yeah, and I don't want to end on a down note, but I'll end with one more cautionary note, which is after going through this period, I'm also very concerned about the number of teachers that will leave the profession. We have now heaped so much pressure on them. And so I would hope that that, as Arne said a few minutes ago, that there is this national reckoning of the importance of teachers, and that we can figure out a way to really, rally around them because they are such a pivotal, those administrators obviously, but are such a pivotal piece of this puzzle of and are deserving of the investment.
Yes.
Dr. Crew?
I want to echo what was just said. I hope that in this change that's taken place, that parents develop a greater appreciation for what teachers have to do, the roles they play, and how important they are in the lives of their children and their children's development. I think in the past, there's been sort of this thought that I've gone to school, I know what teachers need to do, I could do that. And I think there's a new revelation that, in fact, this is a very difficult, challenging, but skilled task. And I hope that as people will recognize that, they will see the need for the kind of investments that we've talked about to give teachers the resources they need to be able to be as effective as possible and to be able to live at a decent level, not have to struggle and work in summers in order to compensate for the lack of funds they get for the regular work.
And Secretary Duncan, last word.
And we need courage, we need leadership, and we need to recognize this as the nation-building work that it is.
Amen.
Thank you so much to all of you. All of us have been enriched by all of these fantastic ideas, and we're all, of course, hoping for better days ahead for all of our educators, all of our families, all of our kids, to really secure the most promising, best future possible for all of these children. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.